I'll go first.
Yeah.
Okay.
Nào.
Okay, so today from our colleagues, you've heard many good examples of infectious diseases and emerging infectious diseases in Thailand and other places in the world. And some information about biodiversity and how that relates to infectious diseases and emerging infectious diseases. I wanted to take a step back to some very simple, basic ideas that are very important to understand with infectious diseases and the relationship with biodiversity. And I want to give you an example from the United States about Lyme disease. Everyone heard of Lyme disease? Okay. And that is a vector-borne disease transmitted by ticks with reservoir hosts and different life stages of the ticks. And it's a very complicated environmental story related to biodiversity. And it helps illustrate some really important concepts. And so I want to just show you some of those concepts to help you think about infectious diseases and emerging diseases here in Thailand and this region, and to ask some of these questions about them and see if there are things that you can help provide answers to with your research in collaboration with biologists and physicians and virologists and so on. So forgive me if this is too basic, but it helps me sometimes when I'm thinking about complicated problems to remind myself about some of the basic principles. And also, please ask questions along the way. And tell me to slow down if I start getting excited and talk really fast like I do all the time. Okay. Nancy. This is Nancy's program, so I blame her for everything when it doesn't behave properly. It's not showing. We're going to start over. Does everyone have an understanding of what we mean when we say biodiversity? What is biodiversity?
อยู่กระทรวงทรัพยากรธรรมชาติและสิ่งแวดล้อม
Okay, so what did they say?
It has no meaning.
It what? It has no meaning?
They have meaning.
They have a meaning.
They have concept.
Okay. They have a concept. But did they give the right definition?
No. They just translate.
Okay.
Translation.
Okay, well we need to know what that means. What is the definition of biodiversity?
Variety of species, ecosystem, and agility.
Okay, excellent. And it's a combination of two words, yes? Biological diversity, biodiversity. Did you try it, Nancy? Is it working?
It is.
Awesome. A program like you and not me.
No.
So that's the definition, the very broad definition, that it's the variety of life on Earth at all its levels, from genes to ecosystems and environmental processes. So really, it's the world. It's everything. It's a really big concept. But we use the term biodiversity to really mean species and in a particular habitat or an ecosystem when we're talking about diseases. So how are biodiversity and infectious disease related? And to me, I think it's really important to keep in mind that pathogens, viruses, bacteria, parasites, are part of biodiversity. They're not something separate. Okay, there's not biodiversity here and infectious disease something separate. Pathogens are part of biodiversity. And so the very complicated relationship between hosts and pathogens and their environments, the other species there, their ecosystems, that's all connected. You cannot separate them out. And when you're trying to study an infectious disease in the wild, you have to study it in its ecosystem and the habitat. It's not like studying an infectious disease in the lab, where you have a mouse, you have a virus, that's all there is, and you study that. In the wild, many, many, many factors, and it's very complicated. And that's why, because of its complexity, that's why taking a collaborative team approach and working in a One Health way with veterinarians, with biologists, physicians, public health experts, virologists, bacteriologists, it's all really important to studying the ecology of infectious disease. So I want to show you an example of how biological diversity, or the species in a particular type of ecosystem, have an impact on Lyme disease. And so I think you know that Lyme disease is caused by a bacteria, by a spirochete, Borrelia burgdorferi. And we'll just go through the life cycle, again, because it's very complicated, and I have to remind myself every so often about the life cycle, because it takes 2 years for the tick, the Ixodes scapularis tick that is responsible for transmitting the majority of Lyme disease, 2 years for that tick to go from egg to adult. So it's very complex and long. So if we start with the tick eggs, in the first year, in the spring, the eggs will hatch into nymphs. And the nymphs are very, very tiny. You can see a sesame seed. The sesame seed for scale, for size, and that is a nymph. It's about 1/10 the size of a sesame seed. And so in the summer, the fall, and the winter of year 1, this nymph, the first stage, lives on a variety of hosts. Okay, and this is Paramiscus leucopus, white-footed deer mouse, a chipmunk, an American robin. These are all hosts that the nymph likes to feed on. And these are all hosts as well that are very commonly carriers or reservoirs of the bacteria, of the Borrelia. So inside each host is the bacteria. In year 2, in the spring, the nymph will shed and molt and become a larvae. I'm sorry, I said it backwards. Those were larvae. Someone should have stopped me. These are larvae, not nymphs, first stage. In the spring, the larvae becomes a nymph. And the infected nymphs will then undergo this behavior called questing. Do you understand what I mean, the questing? So the tick here is on a blade of grass or vegetation, and it's looking for a host. So in the spring, there's hundreds of thousands of ticks. Just waiting for you to walk by, or your dog, or many other potential hosts. So these are all the types of hosts that the nymph likes. And there's quite a variety. They like white-tailed deer. Those are nice big animals. The nymphs like to be on bigger animals than the larvae, okay? So they may like white-tailed deer, or again, the same Paramiscus mouse that the larvae fed on, opossums, raccoons, people and their dogs, okay? So these nymphs that have fed on infected hosts as larvae can transmit the Borrelia bacteria to any of these hosts. And actually, many years of research have shown that there are more than 40 vertebrate hosts for the Ixodes scapularis tick, and also for the Borrelia bacteria. And at this stage, if the tick bites a person, it's a very small tick still at this stage. So if you're hiking in the woods, and it's during the spring, many ticks out waiting for you to come by, that's a larvae. That's a nymph, very, very small. And it's possible for that tick to bite you and you don't know. They'll bite you, take a blood meal, and fall off. And you'll be left, if you are infected with Borrelia, a target lesion like this. And Lyme disease is actually the most common vector-borne disease in the United States. About 30,000 cases per year, and it's increasing every year. And this map shows the distribution of the incidence of Lyme disease in the U.S. So really in the Northeast, around the Great Lakes, and some in California. And these are all places where people are very active. They like to hike, be outdoors with their dogs, and so it's a very common disease. And some of the initial signs you will see in people are flu-like symptoms, fever, aches, joint problems. They can progress to a chronic disease that can be very hard to treat and in some people impossible to cure. But people are a dead-end host. People will not infect ticks with Borrelia, so they cannot complete the life cycle. In the fall of year 2, the nymphs have grown into adults. Okay, this is the biggest stage of life, and they're still very small. Now they're only about the size of a sesame seed. And the adults are looking for hosts on which they can spend the winter. They have to spend several months to get through the winter. Their favorite host to spend the winter on is this nice, big, warm deer. And so that's the role for the deer. But the adult ticks, they can still transmit Lyme disease. And they will also feed on people, on dogs, and many other species like fox and coyote, raccoons, opossums. If they find a host and are able to make it through the winter, in year 3, in the spring, the adult tick will lay many, many thousands, hundreds of thousands of eggs and start all over again. So it's a very complicated life cycle. It takes more than 2 years for the tick to go from egg to adult. And along that way, they are picking up the bacteria from hosts. Once they're infected, when they feed on the next host, they are transmitting the bacteria and then transmitting again as adults. So there's many hosts for the ticks and many bacterial reservoirs for the Lyme disease spirochete. So are all of the hosts, all of the 40-plus vertebrate hosts for the tick and the bacteria, are they all the same? And I think you're probably familiar, you know well about the term reservoir competence. Is that a familiar term? Yes? No? Not sure. Okay. Dr. Parntep, you may have to help me explain. Reservoir competence? So it means if a mouse is infected with Borrelia, with the spirochete, how good is that mouse at passing the infection with the bacteria to a tick that feeds on the tick? So it's either competent, so good at it, or incompetent, bad. And for competent hosts, there are still levels. Very competent, 90% ticks infected. Not so competent, maybe 50% infected. Bad, but still competent, 10% infected. So all of these hosts may differ.
Okay, they don't plan. Okay.
Okay?
They all are.
Okay. So just to give you some examples of these, if we take larvae, so the first stage of the tick, and feed it on an infected white-footed mouse, 90% of the larvae are infected. So that is the most competent reservoir host for Borrelia, for Lyme disease. If we take larvae and feed them on infected chipmunks, only about 55% become infected. So still competent, but not nearly as good as the white-footed mouse. And even lizards can serve as hosts for Borrelia, which is unusual because they're cold-blooded, right? They're reptiles, and quite often pathogens or bacteria that survive well in mammals do not survive well in reptiles. But this is a special case where infected lizards, if we feed larvae on them, 20% of the ticks will be infected from feeding on lizards. And it's a similar story with the nymphs, with the middle life stage. Okay, so if we feed a nymph on an infected deer, only about 5% of the nymphs will become infected. If we feed them on an infected raccoon, about 1%. Okay? An opossum, 3%. But a squirrel, 15%. Okay? And remember that the nymphs They may be infected when they're larvae. So it's also possible for nymphs, if they are infected, to transmit Lyme